For a year, I built a secret life with a man thousands of miles away. I paid for everything, his visa, his escape, his flight to me. I waited for him at the airport, ready to start our life together. But when he walked through the gates, he was holding his wife's hand. The morning in our Palo Alto house always began with silence and pre-programmed comfort. The smart home system smoothly raised the blinds, letting in a measured amount of Californian sun, while the coffee machine was already starting to grind beans for my flat white. Richard, my husband, stood by the panoramic window with a tablet in his hand, already immersed in the world of venture capital and startups. The air smelled of ozone after the nightly cleaning cycle and expensive coffee. Everything was smooth, efficient, and utterly predictable. Our life was like a perfectly written code, no bugs, no unnecessary emotions, with clearly defined functions. He was on a speakerphone call with someone from the fund, tossing out phrases like ecosystem synergy and scaling to a unicorn. I watched him in silence, feeling like a part of this flawless interior, expensive, functional, and quiet. My role was to be the serene backdrop to his relentless ambition, a beautiful object that completed the picture of success he presented to the world. The Indians missed the deadline again, he tossed out after ending the call, his voice flat with casual annoyance. I keep telling you, all this outsourcing is a waste of time and money. Cheap labor will never replace brains from here. He said it so lightly, as if discussing the weather, not noticing how my shoulders tensed under my silk robe. For him, the world was divided into Silicon Valley and everything else, a simple binary system of innovators and executors. I simply nodded, taking a sip of the perfect coffee, the bitterness on my tongue a silent protest. At that moment, my phone, lying on the quartz countertop, emitted a soft, barely perceptible sound that no one heard but me. It wasn't a standard notification signal, but a short, custom tone for a single application, a sound like the click of an exotic bird's beak. It was a sound that belonged to another continent, another life. On the locked screen, for just a fraction of a second, a single word from Deji flashed into existence, stark against the minimalist background, soon. That one word was enough to shatter the sterile perfection of the morning. It was a promise whispered from a world of vibrant chaos and genuine warmth, a world that stood in stark contrast to my gilded cage. My heart began to beat a little faster, a frantic, secret rhythm against the calm, regulated pulse of the house. I could almost feel the phantom warmth of a different sun on my skin, hear the distant, joyful noise of a street market instead of the hum of the air purifier. Richard was already moving toward the closet, selecting one of his identical gray hoodies, his uniform for a day of disrupting industries and creating the future. He didn't look at me, his focus was already on the next task, the next call, the next valuation. I was a background process, an application running silently, consuming minimal resources. But Deji's message was a root command, a backdoor into my carefully constructed operating system, threatening to override everything. I traced the rim of my coffee cup, the ceramic cool against my fingertips. The message wasn't just a word, it was a current of electricity, a jolt that reminded me of a life lived with senses fully engaged. It was the memory of humid air thick with the scent of spices, the press of a crowd, the feeling of his hand finding mine, not for show, but for genuine connection. Here, in this temple of logic and efficiency, such things felt like foreign concepts, illogical variables in a flawless equation. The single word on my screen, soon, held more promise than all of Richard's talk of billion-dollar exits. It was a seed of rebellion planted in the manicured garden of my life. I quickly cleared the notification, my movements practiced and discreet, a muscle memory from a life of hiding my true self. To my husband, I was still the perfect wife in the perfect house, a valuable asset in his portfolio. But the quiet click of the exotic bird had signaled the beginning of a migration, a flight from the predictable comfort of this cage towards a sky I had almost forgotten existed. Our relationship with Deji existed in a space that wasn't on any map, in the shimmering light of screens, in the profound silence of sleepless nights, separated by thousands of miles and an entire ocean. It was a digital ghost, more real to me than the solid walls of my home. He was a programmer from Lagos, a city I knew only through his words and the intermittent background noise of his life. Our acquaintance began on a professional forum, a dry, technical space where we argued over the elegance of a particular coding language. He championed a more dynamic, flexible approach, while I defended the structured, classical methods I'd been taught. His arguments were fierce but respectful, and laced with a passion that was entirely absent from the dispassionate, profit-driven discussions I was used to. He wasn't just solving a problem, he was crafting a solution, and he spoke of code with the reverence of an artist. It was this fire that drew me in. I sent him a private message, conceding a point, and from there, our conversations quickly spilled over the professional boundaries, flowing into the channels of a more personal, encrypted application. He had a way of seeing past the carefully curated persona I presented to the world. He wrote to me about the constant power outages, the deafening roar of generators that became the city's nightly chorus, and the sticky, oppressive heat that clung to everything. He described the vibrant chaos of the markets, the resilience and humor of the people, and his dream of escaping the freelance grind to build something truly his own, something lasting. His messages were filled with a raw, unfiltered life that stood in stark, almost painful contrast to my sterile, climate-controlled world. There was more vitality in his description of a single Lagos traffic jam than in my entire, meticulously scheduled week. Most importantly, he saw me. Not as an investor's wife, a social accessory, or a cog in a corporate machine, but as a developer, a colleague, a mind. Richard, on the rare occasions he looked at my work, saw only lines of logic that could be monetized, a means to an end. Deji saw the architecture, the thought process, the elegance. He would send me snippets of his projects, asking for my opinion on a complex algorithm or a user experience flow. "What do you think of this? I feel like you would find a cleaner way," he'd write, and the validation was intoxicating, a drug I hadn't known I was craving. It was a form of intimacy I had never experienced with my own husband. Richard and I shared a house, a financial portfolio, and a social calendar, but we never shared this meeting of minds, this mutual respect for the craft that had once been my entire world before it became just another asset. With Deji, I could talk for hours about the subtle beauty of a recursive function, and he would understand. He didn't just listen, he would build on my ideas, challenge them, and refine them. He made me feel like the person I used to be, the one who loved the puzzle, not the prize. One night, the digital ghost of our relationship took on a more corporeal form. Richard was asleep in another room, a decision we'd made years ago under the guise of his erratic sleep schedule, but in reality, it was just another layer of polite distance between us. The house was utterly silent, the only sound the low hum of the servers in the basement. I was in my study, the glow of my monitor painting my face in cool, impersonal light. We were on a video call, the first time we had bridged the gap between text and image. A tropical storm was raging outside his window in Lagos, a dramatic, primal force of nature. The power in his building was flickering, a constant, unpredictable strobe. His face would vanish into complete darkness for a few heartbeats, then reappear, illuminated only by the cold, bluish light of his laptop screen. Each time he rematerialized from the shadows, my breath would catch in my throat. He looked tired, the faint lines around his eyes speaking of long hours and constant worry, but his gaze was direct and full of a warmth that traversed the thousands of miles between us effortlessly. The connection was unstable, his voice occasionally breaking up into digital static, but it didn't matter. He was telling me about his younger sister, how he was saving every spare naira to pay for her university tuition. He spoke of her brilliance, her ambition to become a doctor, and his voice was saturated with a tenderness and a sense of profound responsibility that felt utterly alien in my world of detached, scalable solutions. In my life, problems were solved with money, delegated to assistants, or optimized away with technology. In his, they were shouldered with a quiet, fierce love. As he spoke, a sharp, unfamiliar pang of shame pricked at me. My life was so easy, so cushioned, so devoid of any real struggle. My greatest anxieties revolved around social obligations and maintaining the seamless facade of our perfect lives. The designer clothes in my closet, the art on my walls, the car in my garage, each was a symbol of a life I hadn't earned, but had simply married into. Deji was fighting against the constant threat of a failing infrastructure, a volatile economy, and the weight of his family's hopes, all for the simple, noble goal of giving his sister a better future. And I was his confidant, listening from a fortress of privilege. When he finished his story, a heavy silence settled between us. The only sounds were the distant, muffled drumming of the rain against his roof and the quiet hum of my home's air filtration system. We just looked at each other, two faces suspended in the digital ether. His gaze held no judgment, only a deep, weary understanding. And in that shared silence, across an ocean and a continent, a connection was forged that was more real, more tangible than any physical touch I had experienced in years. It was a closeness born of shared vulnerability, a silent acknowledgement of the vast, unfair chasm between our worlds. It was in that moment that the desire, which had been a low, steady hum beneath the surface of our conversations, sharpened into a clear, undeniable ache. It wasn't just a physical longing, it was a desperate yearning for the authenticity he represented. I wanted to be in that small room with him, to feel the humid air, to hear the storm not as a sound effect through my speakers, but as a force of nature outside the window. I wanted to feel the weight of a real problem, a real responsibility, a real love. He was everything my life was not, messy, difficult, and achingly, beautifully real. With a resolve that felt both terrifying and liberating, I made a decision. My fingers moved across the keyboard, opening a new, secure browser window. My heart was pounding against my ribs, a frantic, wild rhythm. I told him I wanted to help, framing it as a professional investment, a contribution to his freelance setup. For better equipment, I typed, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. So the connection is more stable. So we can work more efficiently. It was a flimsy pretext, a corporate-sounding lie to mask the raw, emotional impulse driving me. He protested at first, his pride a palpable thing even through the screen. He insisted he couldn't accept it, that he was fine. But I was gently, firmly insistent, appealing to the logic we both understood. I positioned it not as charity, but as a strategic move, an investment in a promising collaborator. The lie was for him as much as it was for me, a way to preserve the fiction of our professional relationship, to give us both a plausible deniability for what was truly happening between us. He finally, reluctantly, agreed. I navigated to the encrypted international transfer service we both used. My hands were steady as I typed in his account details, a string of numbers that felt more intimate than a phone number. I entered an amount that was, to me, insignificant, less than I might spend on a handbag or a single dinner with Richard's business associates. But I knew that to him, it was a substantial sum, a lifeline that could ease the immense pressure he was under. I paused for a moment before clicking the final confirmation, the screen asking me if I was sure. In that single, suspended moment, I saw my life branching into two distinct paths. One was the smooth, paved, predictable road I was on, leading to more of the same quiet, gilded emptiness. The other was an unknown, unmapped trail into a wilderness of genuine emotion, risk, and consequence. It was a choice between the perfect, lifeless code of my marriage and the chaotic, beautiful, buggy program of a life with real connection. I clicked confirm. The screen refreshed, displaying a simple, sterile receipt. The transaction was complete. It was our first, secret, and irreversible step, a silent pact sealed in the dead of night, witnessed only by a tropical storm and the unblinking eye of a webcam. Lies became my second skin, a layer of insulation tailored with the same precision I applied to writing code. It was not a heavy, suffocating garment, but a sleek, functional interface that allowed me to operate within the rigid parameters of my life while running a completely separate, secret process in the background. My days with Richard remained a study in seamless predictability, but my nights, and every stolen moment in between, were dedicated to the meticulous construction of a new reality. Deception was a system, and I, the architect, refining its logic with each passing day, ensuring there were no bugs, no memory leaks, no trace of my true intentions. The first step was to build a firewall. I opened a separate bank account, a simple online process that felt like a profound act of rebellion. It was a digital vault, a space that belonged only to me, invisible to the shared financial ecosystem of my marriage. Into this account, I diverted a portion of my salary from a consulting project Richard had dismissed as a minor hobby. To him, my income was a rounding error; to me, it became the material from which I would build a bridge. Each automatic transfer was a quiet declaration of independence, a small, steady stream diverted from the main river. Every transfer of funds to Deji was a carefully planned operation, a milestone in our clandestine project. I managed it with the cold focus of a venture capitalist nursing a seed-round startup, masking the frantic, hopeful beating of my own heart. The money left my secret account in calculated sums, each one logged in an encrypted file with a plausible, sterile justification. Phase 1, Visa application fees. Phase 2, legal documentation and counsel. Phase 3, biometrics and embassy logistics. Each transaction was a brick laid in the foundation of the bridge stretching between Lagos and San Francisco, a structure only the two of us could see. His messages chronicled the slow, frustrating crawl through bureaucracy, a world so different from the move fast and break things ethos of Silicon Valley. He wrote of long lines under a punishing sun, of indifferent officials, of the constant, gnawing anxiety of a single misplaced paper derailing everything. I would read his words in the silent, air-conditioned comfort of my home, the contrast of physical ache in my chest. I sent him more money, labeled contingency fund, feeling the thrill of solving a real-world problem, of removing an obstacle from the path of someone I was beginning to care for deeply. The pressure from Richard, meanwhile, was increasing in direct proportion to the progress of my secret project. His casual xenophobia, once a background hum of ignorant privilege, began to sharpen into a focused, angry diatribe. He saw the world as a zero-sum game, with Silicon Valley at its center and a horde of outsiders clamoring at the gates, trying to steal its magic. He was becoming obsessed with the idea of intellectual purity, a concept he conflated entirely with geography and the right university pedigree. His world was shrinking, even as I was trying to build a bridge to a wider one. This culminated one evening at a dinner with several of his fund's partners at a Michelin-starred restaurant in a ridiculously expensive part of San Francisco. The air was thick with the scent of money and self-satisfaction. As dessert was served, a confection of spun sugar and exotic fruit foam, Richard launched into a tirade about the H-1B visa program. He called foreign specialists parasites on the body of the innovation economy, accusing them of depressing wages and leeching ideas before returning to their home countries. His voice was calm, reasonable, which made the words themselves all the more venomous. I sat beside him, the perfect, silent wife, a beautiful piece of art that completed the tableau. I nodded at the appropriate moments, my lips curved into a serene, supportive smile. Inside, a cold fury was building, a rage that tasted like ash in my mouth. I looked at the faces of the other men, all nodding in agreement, and their wives, who mirrored my placid expression. We were all part of the same flawless code, executing our functions without deviation. But I had a hidden script running, a root command that was about to change everything. His every word was another justification for my betrayal. His prejudice made my secret rebellion feel not just sweet, but righteous. I wasn't merely helping a lover escape a difficult situation, I was performing an act of intellectual rescue. I was saving a brilliant mind from the crushing gravity of circumstance and protecting it from the arrogant, blind snobbery of men like my husband. Deji, with his passion and his elegant code written on a flickering laptop powered by a generator, was more of an innovator than any of the complacent men at that table. My deception was no longer just about desire, it had become a moral imperative. A few weeks after that dinner, on a quiet Tuesday evening, it happened. Richard was in his media room, absorbed in a documentary about a legendary tech CEO, another icon for his pantheon of gods. I was in the living room, pretending to read a novel, the physical book a prop in the theater of our marriage. Then, my phone, lying face down on the sofa beside me, emitted its custom sound, the soft, sharp click of the exotic bird. It was a sound that made the hair on my arms stand up, a signal from a world away that cut through the sterile silence. My movements were fluid, practiced from months of secrecy. I picked up the phone, angling the screen away from the door, my body a shield. The message from Deji was not words, but an image. It took a moment for the high-resolution picture to load over the encrypted connection. It was a scanned document, a formal letterhead, a series of stamps. And in the upper right-hand corner was a small, square photograph of his face, serious for the camera, but his eyes were incandescent. It was his visa. Approved. Valid for 3 years. The bridge was no longer a theoretical blueprint, it was real. A wave of dizziness washed over me. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a frantic, wild drumbeat that felt loud enough to shake the room. I was terrified that Richard, cocooned in his world of surround sound, would somehow hear it, that he would sense the tectonic shift that had just occurred in the foundations of our life. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my body into a state of artificial calm. I looked at the visa on my screen, this simple piece of paper that represented so much hope, so much risk, so many lies. We had done it. We were almost there. He had attached a short message beneath the image. "All that's left is the ticket," he wrote. "Anna, I am almost there. We are almost there." The word we hung in the air, a beautiful, terrifying promise. I closed my eyes for a second, picturing his face, not the grainy passport photo, but the real, living man I had seen on our video calls, his smile lighting up a dark room. The risks I was taking, the intricate web of lies I had woven, all of it coalesced into this single, triumphant moment. The fear was still there, but it was now overshadowed by a powerful, soaring exhilaration. That night, I waited until the house was completely still. I watched the indicator light on Richard's bedroom door turn off, and then I waited another full hour, listening to the rhythmic, quiet hum of the home systems. The silence felt different now, it was no longer empty, but filled with the tension of imminent change. I slipped into my study, the glow of my monitor the only light in the room. I logged into my secret account, my fingers moving with purpose. This was the final, most critical transaction, the one that would complete the bridge and make it ready to be crossed. I initiated the largest transfer I had ever made, a sum that was far from trivial, even by my standards. It was enough for a one-way business class ticket. I wanted him to arrive rested, to walk off that plane with dignity, and enough to cover a security deposit on an apartment and living expenses for the first few months. This was not a small contribution for equipment anymore. This was an activation fee. This was the point of no return. My finger hovered over the confirmation button on the screen, the cursor blinking like a steady heartbeat. In that final, suspended moment, the two competing feelings crested within me, pure, cold terror and a wild, uncontainable joy. I was sabotaging my entire life, risking the loss of my home, my security, my social standing. But I was also stepping out of a cage, breathing my first gulp of free, unfiltered air. I was choosing the chaotic, unpredictable beauty of a life I wanted over the sterile perfection of a life I had been assigned. I pressed the button. The screen flashed its confirmation. The money was gone. The bridge was finished. Now, all I had to do was wait for him to take the first step. The day of his arrival felt like a glitch in the simulation, a surreal overlay on the crisp, high-definition reality of my life. I had taken a personal day from work, the lie of a migraine slipping from my lips with practiced ease during a morning call. It was a plausible excuse, the kind of minor, feminine ailment that required no further questions. Richard had left early for a series of board meetings in the city, his electric car whispering out of the driveway, leaving the house in my soul, trembling possession. The silence he left behind was immense, a vacuum that I immediately filled with my own frantic, circular thoughts. I paced the length of the house, from the cool marble of the kitchen to the soft, deep pile carpet of the living room, a ghost haunting my own life. I couldn't settle. Every surface was too clean, every angle too perfect. The programmed comfort of the house felt like a mockery, its automated systems a stark contrast to the chaotic, unscripted humanity that was about to breach its walls. I ran through dozens of scenarios for our meeting, each one a perfect, romantic fantasy. I saw him emerge from the crowd, his eyes finding mine in an instant of recognition. I felt the impossible warmth of his hand in mine, the solid, living proof that he was real. The digital mirage, our entire relationship, was just hours away from becoming tangible. The thought was both a source of profound ecstasy and paralyzing terror. What if the chemistry that sparked so brilliantly through encrypted text and unstable video feeds didn't translate across the sterile air of the arrivals hall? What if the man who emerged was a stranger, a collection of pixels and data who bore no resemblance to the soul I had connected with in the dead of night? I changed my outfit 3 times, discarding a silk blouse for a simple cashmere sweater, wanting to look effortlessly beautiful, the person he imagined me to be. I drove to the San Francisco International Airport with the windows down, letting the cool Bay Area air whip through the car, a futile attempt to clear my head. The familiar journey up the 101 freeway felt alien, every landmark a strange signpost on a pilgrimage to a new life. The sprawling campuses of tech giants slid past, monuments to the world I was preparing to betray. For the first time, their sleek glass and steel structures looked not like temples of innovation, but like beautiful, sterile prisons. I was breaking out, and my co-conspirator was about to land. I arrived at the international terminal a full hour before his flight was scheduled to land, my anxiety too great to allow for a strategically timed entrance. The airport was a thrumming hive of its own contained humanity, a constant flow of greetings and goodbyes, of tearful reunions and somber farewells. I found a spot near the customs exit, positioning myself against a pillar, trying to look casual, like any other person waiting for a friend or family member. I felt completely anonymous and yet horribly exposed, as if my secret were a bright, pulsing aura visible to everyone who passed. My heart was a frantic, erratic thing in my chest, a wild bird beating against the cage of my ribs. Every time the automatic doors slid open to release a new wave of passengers, a jolt of adrenaline shot through me. I scanned the faces, a diverse sea of weary travelers, searching for the one I knew only from a screen. I saw families reuniting, their joyous cries echoing in the cavernous hall. I saw business travelers, their faces set with purpose, striding towards the exit. Each person who wasn't him was both a disappointment and a momentary reprieve, delaying the terrifying, wonderful moment of truth. And then I saw him. The world seemed to slow down, the background noise of the airport fading into a distant hum. He was even taller and leaner than he appeared on video, with a grace in his movements that the choppy connection had never conveyed. He pushed a luggage cart with one hand, his head on a swivel as he took in the vast, overwhelming space, a look of bewildered, joyful discovery on his face. It was the face I had spent countless nights staring at, the smile I had worked so hard to bring here. He was real. The mirage had solidified. He was here. The single, overwhelming truth of it washed over me, drowning out the fear. My carefully constructed bridge had held. He had crossed it. I felt a surge of triumphant, possessive joy. I had done this. I had brought him here. I pushed myself off the pillar, a magnetic force pulling me towards him. My lips parted to call his name, the sound catching in my throat as I took my first step. But I froze, my body rigid, my feet rooted to the polished floor. The entire, beautiful fantasy shattered into a million sharp, glittering pieces. He was not alone. Walking beside him, her arm linked comfortably through his, was a young black woman, about his age, radiating a serene confidence. She was beautiful, with an easy smile and eyes that were taking in their new surroundings with a calm, curious gaze. My mind, a machine trained to process data and find logical patterns, scrambled for an explanation. It had to be his sister. The one he had told me about, the brilliant one he was putting through school. Yes, that was it. He had brought her with him, a surprise, a celebration of their new life. I clung to this explanation, a desperate anchor in a suddenly churning sea. But then, as they walked closer, he leaned down and whispered something in her ear, his lips brushing against her hair. She tilted her head back and laughed, a sound of pure, uninhibited delight. It was not the laugh of a sister. The gesture, the shared, private moment, was saturated with an easy, unforced intimacy that struck me with the force of a physical blow. A cold dread, sharp and swift, pierced through the layers of my carefully constructed fantasy. It was a single, anomalous data point that threatened to corrupt my entire system. This was not a relative. They continued to walk towards the exit, towards me. The woman's eyes scanned the waiting crowd and settled on me. Her smile did not waver. She looked from me to Deji, then back to me, and in her gaze, there was no surprise, no flash of jealousy or confusion. There was only a calm, placid, almost businesslike sense of expectation. She had known I would be here. This was a scheduled stop on their itinerary. The cold dread inside me began to crystallize into a heavy, sinking certainty. I was not a co-conspirator in a love story. I was a line item in a business plan. Deji finally saw me. His wide, happy smile faltered for a fraction of a second, the light in his eyes dimming as it was replaced by a flicker of profound, unmistakable awkwardness. The joy vanished, replaced by the uncomfortable expression of a man caught in a lie he had not yet prepared to tell. He gently disentangled his arm from the woman's, leaving her a single, calculated step behind as he approached me. The distance between us, once thousands of miles, now felt like an impassable chasm of just a few feet. The air crackled with everything that had been left unsaid. "Anna," he said, and his voice was all wrong. Without the digital compression and the faint static of a poor connection, it sounded deeper, richer, and completely alien. It was the voice of a stranger. "Thank you for coming. I'm so glad you're here." The words were polite, rehearsed, a script he was reciting from memory. He gestured back towards the woman, who was now watching us with that same unnervingly calm expression. "I want you to meet someone. This is Amara." He paused, taking a shallow breath, the final, devastating line delivered with a quiet, almost apologetic finality. "My wife." We sat in a faceless airport coffee shop, a purgatory of transient souls bathed in the unforgiving glare of fluorescent lights. The harsh, flat lighting stripped all the color from our faces, rendering us pale, weary, and exposed. I stared at the dark, untouched surface of the coffee in my paper cup, watching my own distorted reflection. Words were a physical impossibility, a thick, painful lump of humiliation and shock lodged in my throat. I couldn't breathe, let alone speak. The entire, elaborate architecture of my secret life had been demolished in a single sentence, and I was buried in the rubble. Deji was a study in shame. He sat hunched over his own cup, his gaze fixed on the swirling cream, as if the answers to this disaster could be found in its depths. The man whose digital voice had been my lifeline, whose pixelated face had been my icon of hope, was now just a stranger avoiding my eyes. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. It was Amara who finally broke it. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm and steady, with a clinical precision that chilled me to the bone. It was the voice of a nurse delivering a difficult diagnosis, devoid of pity but full of indisputable fact. She did not apologize. She did not offer condolences for the fantasy she had just murdered. She simply explained, laying out the facts of their situation with a dispassionate clarity. Their marriage, she stated, was a legitimate, legally binding contract, but its purpose was purely functional. She was a United States citizen. He was not. This was their path to a green card, a transaction that exchanged her legal status for his chance at a future. It was, she said, looking me directly in the eye, their only viable option, the final move in a game they could not afford to lose. The plan had been in place for over a year. The next words she spoke landed like methodical, targeted blows. She had known about me from the very beginning. She had read our chats, knew the cadence of our late-night conversations. She knew about the arguments over code, the shared dreams, the carefully constructed intimacy. She knew about the money. Every single transfer, from the first small amount for equipment to the final, life-altering sum for the plane ticket. She had watched it all unfold, not as a jealous wife, but as a project manager tracking the flow of capital into a critical venture. In her eyes, I was not a rival. I was their investor. I was the unwitting, remote sponsor for their desperate, brilliant, and cruel escape plan. "This wasn't a scam in the way you're thinking," she said, her gaze unwavering, compelling me to meet it. There was no malice there, only a profound, weary pragmatism. "We didn't spend your money on cars or diamonds. Every single cent went into the logistics of getting him out of there. Every cent was a step away from a dead end. It was a chance for both of us to have a normal life." She was recasting my grand, secret romance as a series of funding round for their two-person startup. The product was Deji's freedom. Her story continued to unspool in the sterile air of the coffee shop, a narrative of grim reality that systematically dismantled my privileged fantasy. She worked the night shift as a registered nurse at a hospital in Oakland, a grueling, underpaid job that left her exhausted but solvent. They were living in a tiny studio apartment that she had secured before he even arrived, a place where the sound of streetcars and sirens was the constant soundtrack. My money, the sum that had felt so powerful and transformative to me, had been just enough to cover the security deposit, the first month's rent, and the barest of necessities. There was no remorse in her voice, no hint of an apology for the emotional devastation she was inflicting. There was only the bone-deep tiredness of a person for whom survival had long ago superseded the luxury of conventional morality. She spoke of their lives with the detached air of someone describing a complex problem they had finally solved. The problem was their lack of opportunity, the solution was a strategic marriage. I was simply a necessary variable in that equation, the external financing required to make the numbers work. My feelings were collateral damage, an unfortunate but acceptable operational loss. The most horrific part of it all was the creeping, undeniable sense of understanding that began to seep through the cracks of my shock. I was not the victim of a simple, sleazy love affair scam. This was something far more complex, far more logical. I had been absorbed into their business plan, a functional component sourced for my specific resources. My emotional vulnerability, my secret dissatisfaction with my own life, my access to disposable income, these were not qualities they had preyed upon out of malice, but assets they had identified and leveraged with the cold, strategic precision of a good CEO. I finally looked at Deji, who flinched as my eyes met his. He looked smaller now, stripped of the heroic, intellectual aura I had projected onto him. He was just a tired man, trapped between two women who had, in their own ways, engineered his current reality. He opened his mouth to speak, his name for me, Anna, a weak, broken sound. But Amara placed a hand on his arm, a gesture of both quiet ownership and gentle silencing. It was her narrative to control. She had managed the project from the start, and she would manage its difficult, final debriefing with the primary investor. She explained that Deji would honor his side of their bargain, whatever that was. He had skills, he would work, he would contribute. Their life together would not be a romance, but a partnership, a joint venture founded on mutual desperation and a shared goal of a better life. She spoke of this with no romance, but with a kind of grim respect. They were two people pulling themselves up by any means necessary. And I, with my perfect house and my wealthy husband and my casual, easy life, had been their bootstrap. The irony was a physical, bitter taste in my mouth. All the late-night conversations, the shared vulnerabilities, the intellectual sparks, I saw them now through Amara's eyes. They weren't the building blocks of a secret love, they were due diligence. He had been proving his value, demonstrating the quality of the asset she was helping him export. His passion for code, his dreams, his stories about his sister, it was all part of the prospectus, designed to elicit the emotional investment necessary to secure the financial one. My feelings hadn't been the goal, they had been the most efficient mechanism to achieve it. And the worst part, the part that would haunt me long after the humiliation faded, was that their logic was unassailable. I lived in a world built on this exact brand of ruthless pragmatism. Richard and his partners spoke this language every day. They talked of disrupting industries and leveraging assets, of user acquisition costs and return on investment. Amara and Deji had simply applied the cutthroat principles of Silicon Valley to the business of human survival. They had identified an inefficient market, my emotional and financial surplus, and had exploited it for maximum gain. My money, which for me was the currency of a forbidden, thrilling passion, a rebellion against my sterile life, was for them the price of freedom itself. It was the fee for escaping a world of failing electricity and limited horizons. Staring at their two exhausted, determined faces, illuminated by the cold, impartial fluorescent light, I couldn't even summon the righteous anger I felt I deserved. I saw their story not as a betrayal, but as a system. A desperate, human algorithm designed to solve an impossible problem. And I had been the perfect, willing, and entirely predictable input. 2 months passed. The silence that followed the explosion of truth was not a peaceful one, it was the tense, ringing silence of a battlefield after the bombs have fallen. Nobody left. The clean, simple narrative I had imagined, either a romantic escape or a dramatic exit, had collapsed into a tangled, ugly knot of mutual dependency. We were bound together in a configuration that none of us had designed but none of us could escape. It was a prison of our own collective making, its bars forged from desperation, lies, and a terrible, pragmatic logic that had taken root in the ruins of my fantasy. I couldn't expose them. To reveal their deception would be to detonate my own life. I would have to confess everything to Richard, the infidelity, the secret accounts, the systematic transfer of funds. It would mean the end of my marriage, the loss of my home, the public humiliation. My perfectly curated existence, my life of clean code and predictable outcomes, would suffer a catastrophic, unrecoverable system failure. The very stability I had found so suffocating was now the only thing keeping me from falling into a complete abyss. My cage, it turned out, was also my shield. They, in turn, could not simply disappear into the American landscape as they had planned. Their fragile foothold in this country, I quickly learned, was not yet secure. It still depended on my silence, and, as it turned out, on my continued financial support. Their carefully calculated plan had one fatal flaw: it had underestimated the brutal, soul-crushing expense of living in the Bay Area. The numbers didn't add up. Their budget, which must have seemed so robust from the distance of Lagos, was hemorrhaging money at an alarming rate. They were sinking, and I was their only lifeline. The nature of our relationship mutated from a failed romance into a grim, ongoing business negotiation. I was no longer the lover, the confidant, or even the victim. I had been relegated to the role of a reluctant, non-voting board member in their 2-person startup, Survival Incorporated. My function was simple: to provide emergency funding rounds whenever they faced a shortfall. Our clandestine meetings, once anticipated with a thrill of forbidden romance, became tense, quarterly reviews held in the soul-crushing anonymity of neutral territory. We were a toxic, 3-person entity. Our new boardrooms were park benches overlooking duck ponds, or the noisy, chaotic food courts of suburban shopping malls. Surrounded by the mundane drama of other people's lives, we would conduct our business. Amara was always the one to lead the discussion. She was the CEO, the CFO, the one with the hard data. She would bring printouts of their bank statements and a spreadsheet of their expenses, the cheap paper a stark contrast to the glossy pitch decks Richard reviewed. Her voice would remain calm and steady as she pointed out the deficits, the unexpected car repair, the rising cost of groceries. We discussed bills, not feelings. There was no room for accusations or apologies; those were luxuries our strange arrangement could not afford. Deji would sit in silence beside her, his gaze fixed on some distant point, a shadow of the man who had debated the finer points of recursive functions with me for hours. He was now a junior partner, tasked with providing progress reports on his job search. He would speak in a low monotone about sending out resumes, about the difficulty of getting interviews without local experience, about the freelance gigs that paid too little and demanded too much. With each meeting, a piece of me withered and died. After our grim accounting was complete, I would go to the restroom or sit in my car and make the transfer from my secret account. The act of sending the money was a complex cocktail of emotions. I felt the bitter sting of the victim, being forced to pay for my own heartbreak. But I also felt the queasy complicity of an accomplice, actively funding the life that had been built on my deception. I was simultaneously being extorted and enabling the extortionists, trapped in a recursive loop of my own making. One late afternoon, we were sitting on a worn wooden bench in a park in a featureless suburb somewhere between my world and theirs. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, melancholic shadows across the grass. We had just concluded another tense budget review. Amara had shown me their rent statement, highlighting the upcoming increase. I had already agreed to cover it. The transaction was complete, our business for the day concluded, but for some reason, none of us moved. We just sat there, three strangers bound by a shared, unutterable secret. A car drove past on the nearby street, its windows down, blasting a vibrant, percussive Nigerian song. The music, so full of life and rhythm, felt like an artifact from another universe dropped into our silent, gray reality. Deji, who had been staring at his worn sneakers, slowly closed his eyes. A flicker of something real, something unguarded, crossed his face. It was a shadow of the man I had known through the screen, the passionate, frustrated, hopeful man dreaming of a world beyond his small room. It was a look of profound, aching nostalgia, a momentary glimpse of the soul I thought I was saving. Amara saw it too. Without a word, she reached over and placed her hand on top of his, her fingers gently covering his clenched fist. It was not a gesture of romantic love, not the kind I had dreamed of. It was something quieter, deeper, and far more powerful. It was a gesture of profound solidarity, of a shared and difficult journey. It said, "I am here with you. We are in this together. We will see this through." It was the gesture of a true partner, a co-founder in the desperate enterprise of their new life, and it drew a clear, unbreachable line in the space between them and me. In that small, silent gesture, I saw the entirety of my predicament with a blinding, painful clarity. I was sitting right next to them, my body just inches away, but I was not on their side of that line. I was the alien element, the third point in an unnatural triangle. I was their resource, their safety net, their problem and solution all rolled into one. I was absolutely, fundamentally necessary to their survival, but I was not, and would never be, a part of their world. My presence was a condition of their existence here, but my participation in their life was impossible. The bridge I had so carefully, so secretly, so hopefully constructed was not a bridge to a new life for me. I had simply been the architect and the financier of an escape route for two other people. I had paid for the ticket, meticulously planned the journey, and cleared the path, only to find that the destination was never meant for me. They had crossed over to the other side, and now, I was stuck on the bridge with them, in a strange, silent limbo. I could not force them to go back. I could not abandon them to fall. And I could not follow them to a shore where I would never belong. I was trapped by the consequences of my own hope, a prisoner of my own pity and their unyielding, desperate will to survive.